Most people grow older. Very few become mature. Have you ever met someone who looked completely adult on the outside, but emotionally still reacted to life like a frightened child? Someone who becomes defensive very quickly. Someone who needs reassurance constantly, but pretends they do not. Someone who cannot handle criticism without quietly collapsing inside. And sometimes, if we are honest enough, we recognize parts of ourselves in that too. Because becoming an adult happens automatically. Time does that for us. But maturity is different. Maturity is psychological, and many people grow older physically without ever fully growing inwardly. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung once believed that people can spend their entire lives becoming socially acceptable without ever becoming fully themselves. Maybe this is why so many adults today feel emotionally exhausted. Not because they are weak, but because many people learned how to perform adulthood without ever learning how to emotionally understand themselves. They know how to work, how to succeed, how to appear confident, how to appear emotionally intelligent. But underneath that performance, many people still feel deeply fragile. A small criticism ruins their day. A delayed reply creates anxiety. Silence feels threatening. Rejection feels unbearable. And sometimes people do not even realize how emotionally reactive they are, because these patterns have existed for so long that they simply feel normal. Perhaps this is the real difference between being an adult and being mature. An adult can function in society, but maturity is something deeper. It is the ability to face yourself honestly, without constantly escaping into blame, distraction, validation, performance, or emotional reactions. And maybe real maturity begins the moment a person stops asking, "How do I appear stable?" and starts asking, "Why am I so emotionally controlled by things I barely understand inside myself?" Psychologist Erikson believed that human beings develop psychologically in stages throughout life. But emotional growth is not automatic. A person can become older physically while emotionally remaining trapped inside unresolved patterns from much earlier in life. One of Erikson's earliest ideas was something called trust versus mistrust. In simple terms, children slowly learn whether the world feels emotionally safe or emotionally unpredictable. If love feels stable and emotionally consistent, the child slowly develops a sense of safety inside themselves. But if affection feels inconsistent, warm one moment and distant the next, something very different can begin forming underneath. Fear of abandonment, emotional insecurity, hypervigilance, the feeling that love can disappear suddenly. And many adults still carry these emotional patterns without fully realizing it. Sometimes a person is not emotionally reactive because they are dramatic. Sometimes part of them still feels emotionally unsafe inside. This is why certain situations can trigger reactions that feel much bigger than the situation itself. A delayed message, a colder tone, a little emotional distance, and suddenly, the nervous system reacts as if something dangerous is happening. Not because the situation is catastrophic, but because older emotional fears quietly wake up underneath it. This is why some people constantly overthink relationships. They replay conversations in their head, check their phone repeatedly, need reassurance constantly, but feel ashamed for needing it. And often, they do not even fully understand why they feel so emotionally affected. Part of them simply feels unsafe. This is also why some adults struggle deeply with being alone. Without distraction or validation, they suddenly feel confronted by emotions they usually avoid. And so they search constantly for something outside themselves to stabilize what feels unstable inside. Attention, relationships, achievement, approval. But external reassurance can never permanently solve an internal feeling of emotional insecurity. This is why reassurance only works temporarily. A person feels calm for a moment, then slowly becomes anxious again, because the deeper fear underneath was never fully resolved. Erikson also believed that one of the most important psychological tasks in life is developing a stable sense of identity. Not a role, not a performance, not a version of yourself created for approval. A real inner sense of self. The ability to ask, "Who am I when nobody is validating me?" But many people never fully answer that question. Instead, they slowly build their identity around external reactions. Whether people approve of them, need them, admire them, choose them. And this creates a very fragile form of emotional stability. Because when identity depends entirely on validation, even small rejection can begin feeling emotionally devastating. This is where adulthood and maturity begin separating. Because a mature person slowly develops an inner center of stability. But an emotionally immature person often depends completely on external reactions to feel emotionally okay. And perhaps this is why so many adults appear functional externally, while internally feeling anxious, reactive, emotionally fragile, or lost. Not because something is wrong with them, but because emotional maturity requires something many people were never taught. How to feel safe enough to face themselves honestly without constantly needing the outside world to stabilize what feels unstable within them. When people do not feel emotionally secure inside themselves, they often begin searching for safety somewhere else. And very early in life, many people quietly learn something important. Certain versions of themselves receive more love than others. Some emotions are welcomed, others are ignored, criticized, or rejected. A child may learn that being quiet keeps the peace. Another learns that being successful earns approval. Another learns that being emotionally easy to handle makes people stay. And slowly, people begin shaping themselves around acceptance. Carl Jung believed many people spend their lives wearing what he called a persona, a social mask. Not necessarily fake, but carefully shaped to become acceptable, admired, needed, or emotionally safe in the eyes of others. And everyone develops this to some degree. The problem begins when the performance slowly becomes stronger than the real person underneath it. When someone becomes so focused on being accepted that they slowly lose contact with what they genuinely feel. This is why many adults no longer ask themselves, "What do I actually feel?" Instead, they ask, what version of myself will be accepted? And modern life quietly intensifies this even more. People are constantly rewarded for performance. Performance of success, performance of confidence, performance of happiness, performance of self-awareness. Sometimes people become so skilled at appearing emotionally intelligent that even they no longer realize how disconnected they are from themselves underneath. This creates a strange kind of emptiness, because eventually, a person can become admired socially while privately feeling lost inside. They know how to function, how to adapt, how to impress, but when they are finally alone with themselves, there is often a quiet feeling of confusion underneath. Because deep down, they no longer know which parts are real and which parts were created simply to survive emotionally. This is one of the most exhausting things about constantly performing for acceptance. The nervous system never fully relaxes. Because somewhere underneath the performance is the fear that if people saw the real self completely, love or belonging might disappear. This is why some people feel emotionally drained even when their life appears successful externally. They are not only managing life, they are managing an identity constantly, managing how they are perceived, managing emotional approval, managing how acceptable they appear to other people. And perhaps this is why so many adults feel disconnected from themselves today. Because they spent years learning how to become acceptable to the world without learning how to remain emotionally connected to who they actually are underneath the performance. When people hear the word immature, they often imagine obvious childish behavior. But emotional immaturity is usually much quieter than that. Sometimes it hides inside very normal adult behavior. A person may look calm externally, while internally being completely controlled by insecurity, fear, validation, or emotional reactions they barely understand themselves. And one of the clearest signs of emotional immaturity is the inability to tolerate emotional discomfort. If someone feels criticized, they immediately become defensive. Not because the criticism is cruel, but because criticism feels emotionally threatening to their identity. A small comment can suddenly feel like rejection, failure, humiliation. And instead of pausing long enough to understand what they are feeling internally, they react automatically. They explain themselves aggressively, withdraw emotionally, become cold, attack back. Sometimes they replay the criticism in their head for hours afterward, not because they are weak, but because emotionally immature people often experience discomfort as danger. This is also why insecurity can quietly become controlling behavior. A person may constantly monitor someone's tone, attention, or replies, not because they consciously want control, but because uncertainty creates emotional panic underneath. And often, they do not know how to calm that panic internally. So instead, they try to control the outside environment to calm the inside feeling. This is why emotionally immature people sometimes create emotional tests unconsciously. They become distant to see if someone notices. They seek reassurance indirectly instead of honestly communicating insecurity. Sometimes they say, "It's fine," while quietly building resentment underneath. Because emotionally immature people often struggle to communicate emotional needs directly, partly because vulnerability still feels unsafe to them. And so emotions become indirect behaviors instead. Silence becomes punishment. Distance becomes protection. Coldness becomes self-defense. This is also why emotionally immature adults often depend heavily on validation. Their mood changes depending on how accepted, wanted, or reassured they feel. Attention creates temporary emotional relief. Reassurance creates temporary stability. But eventually the anxiety quietly returns again, because validation cannot permanently stabilize someone who still feels internally unstable underneath. And perhaps this is one of the deepest signs of immaturity: the inability to remain present with yourself without immediately needing reassurance, distraction, control, or escape. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And maybe this is why so many adults keep repeating the same emotional patterns, the same insecurities, the same reactions, the same relationship problems. Because what remains unconscious continues controlling behavior automatically. And perhaps real maturity begins the moment a person stops asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and starts asking, "What emotional patterns inside me keep recreating the same pain?" Real maturity does not mean becoming emotionless. Mature people still feel fear, insecurity, jealousy, anger, sadness. The difference is not that mature people stop feeling difficult emotions. The difference is that their emotions no longer completely control their behavior automatically. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl once wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space." And perhaps maturity begins inside that space, because emotionally immature people often react immediately. An emotion appears and instantly becomes behavior. Anger becomes attack. Fear becomes control. Insecurity becomes jealousy. Shame becomes blame. But maturity slowly develops the ability to pause before reacting. Not suppressing emotion, not pretending to be calm, but remaining conscious enough to observe what is happening internally before unconsciously acting it out externally. And this is much harder than most people realize, because sitting with uncomfortable emotions can feel deeply unsettling at first, especially for people who spent years escaping discomfort automatically. Sometimes maturity looks like feeling rejected, without immediately seeking reassurance. Sometimes it looks like feeling insecure, without trying to control another person to reduce the anxiety. Sometimes it looks like feeling criticized, but remaining open long enough to ask, "Why did this affect me so strongly?" instead of instantly becoming defensive. This is why maturity often feels quieter than people expect. It happens internally first, inside very small moments. The moment someone notices their emotional reaction before automatically acting on it. The moment someone tolerates discomfort instead of escaping it immediately. The moment someone becomes honest enough to admit, "I am not reacting only to this situation. Something deeper inside me is being triggered too." And this kind of self-awareness changes everything slowly. Because once a person begins recognizing their unconscious emotional patterns, they stop feeling completely controlled by them. And one of the deepest signs of maturity is emotional responsibility. A mature person stops making other people responsible for emotions they refuse to face themselves. This does not mean mature people never need support. It means they stop expecting other people to constantly stabilize their inner world for them. Because eventually, mature people realize that no relationship can permanently fix an emotional instability that was never understood internally. Carl Jung believed real psychological growth begins when people stop running away from the parts of themselves they dislike. Their insecurity, their envy, their fear, their need for validation. Emotionally immature people usually protect the image they want others to see. But mature people slowly become willing to see themselves more honestly. Not with cruelty, not with self-hatred, but with enough emotional stability to stop constantly defending a false image of themselves. And strangely, this honesty often makes people calmer. Because people become less emotionally fragile once they stop spending all their energy trying to appear perfect. And perhaps this is the real beginning of maturity. The moment a person becomes emotionally strong enough to face themselves honestly, without immediately escaping into denial, performance, blame, distraction, or reaction. Many people confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth. But they are not the same thing. Sometimes emotional chaos does not come from love. It comes from fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not feeling emotionally safe. This is why emotionally immature relationships often feel exhausting. Everything feels extreme. A delayed reply feels personal. A small change in tone creates anxiety. A little distance suddenly feels threatening. And because emotionally immature people struggle to regulate fear internally, relationships slowly become places where they search constantly for reassurance and emotional stability. This is why some people unconsciously treat love like emotional survival. They need constant closeness, constant reassurance, constant proof that the connection is still safe. Not because they are manipulative, but because emotional uncertainty feels unbearable to them internally. And often, they confuse control with safety. One person becomes anxious when the other needs space. They monitor changes in behavior constantly, overanalyze messages, become emotionally reactive to small shifts in attention. Sometimes they withdraw emotionally to see if the other person notices. Sometimes they seek reassurance indirectly instead of honestly communicating insecurity. And underneath all these behaviors is usually the same hidden fear. If I stop feeling emotionally reassured, will I still feel safe? But mature love feels very different. Not cold, not detached. Just calmer, more grounded, less controlled by fear. Because mature people slowly learn how to remain emotionally connected without completely losing themselves inside relationships. They allow emotional space without immediately panicking. They tolerate boundaries, silence, disagreement, not because they never feel insecure, but because they no longer believe every uncomfortable emotion must immediately become behavior. This changes relationships completely. A mature person can feel anxious without becoming controlling. They can feel hurt without instantly punishing the other person emotionally. And perhaps this is one of the deepest signs of maturity: the ability to experience emotion without unconsciously forcing other people to carry responsibility for it. Because mature people slowly understand something important. Another person cannot permanently stabilize someone who refuses to understand themselves internally. And maybe this is why maturity feels quieter than people expect. Because emotionally mature people are no longer reacting to every feeling as if their emotional survival depends on it. They slowly realize, not every fear reveals truth. Not every insecurity deserves obedience. Not every uncomfortable emotion must immediately become behavior. And that realization changes the entire emotional atmosphere of a person's life. Perhaps this is the real difference between becoming older and becoming mature. Age changes the body automatically, but maturity requires confrontation. Confronting insecurity, fear, emotional patterns, painful truths about yourself. And many people spend years avoiding this inner confrontation. Because self-awareness can feel uncomfortable. It is painful to realize that some reactions you called personality were actually emotional survival patterns. Painful to realize how much of your emotional life may have been shaped by fear, insecurity, or the need for validation. Sometimes people spend years believing they are simply guarded, independent, or overprotective, and only later begin realizing that underneath those identities were unresolved emotional fears quietly shaping behavior all along. This is why genuine maturity often begins with a kind of grief. The grief of realizing how long you may have lived disconnected from yourself. How much energy was spent performing stability instead of actually feeling stable inside. And for many people, this realization is frightening at first, because once you begin seeing your unconscious patterns clearly, it becomes much harder to continue hiding from them. You begin noticing the defensiveness, the emotional avoidance, the need for reassurance, the fear of rejection, the performance. But perhaps this discomfort is where real maturity actually begins. Not perfection, not becoming flawless, but becoming honest enough to stop unconsciously repeating the same patterns forever. Carl Jung believed that people become more conscious when they stop avoiding the parts of themselves they once refused to see. And maybe this is why real maturity often makes people softer. Not weaker, just less defensive. Because emotionally mature people no longer spend all their energy protecting a fragile image of themselves. They slowly become more real instead. And perhaps real maturity is not becoming someone entirely new. Perhaps it is finally becoming honest enough to stop hiding from who you already are. Maybe maturity is not measured by age, intelligence, status, or success. Maybe it is measured by how honestly a person can face themselves without immediately escaping into blame, performance, distraction, control, or denial. Because some people grow older while remaining emotionally controlled by fear, insecurity, validation, and unconscious patterns. And others slowly learn how to remain emotionally awake inside their own lives. Perhaps that is the real difference, not between young and old, but between reacting unconsciously to life and learning how to consciously live it. Growing older changes how you look, Maturity changes how honestly you can look at yourself.